Hello and welcome to Mr. Clark After Dark, everyone. My name is Lucas Clark and I am a certified educator with Alberta Education and the Alberta Teachers Association. All conversations and interactions exchanged is intended for educational and entertainment purposes only. In no way does the content discussed intend to be in violation of the ATA Code of Conduct or meant to target any individual student, teacher, or to belittle or demean the profession in any way. If you have something that you would like me to discuss or have a story of your own to share, please reach out at lucasrdclark97@gmail.com. You can also send a direct message to me on Instagram at Mr. Clark After Dark. Hope you enjoy the show, and please do not forget to subscribe. And now, on to the show. Hope you all enjoy. Hello and welcome back to another episode of Mr. Clark After Dark. Today I had the absolute privilege of having on the one and only Tim Coates on the podcast. Tim is a kind of a social studies guru here in the province of Alberta, has been teaching for more than 40 years and does various PD sessions throughout Alberta, Canada, and throughout the United States. It truly was a pleasure to have a conversation with him on this day. Tim is a former Diploma Exam Manager for social studies in Alberta. He is currently a Sessional Instructor at the University of Alberta and has been teaching in the profession for more than 40 years. On part one of the conversation today, Tim and I discussed the purpose of social studies and how to relay its importance to our students, being scared of being a communist when he was younger, the various social studies curricula he has taught and how they are different, thinking styles, how the diploma exam may change with the new curriculum, developing the current curriculum back in 2005 to 2007, the balance of quote-unquote specificity in developing curriculum and the program of studies, how the textbook is not actually the program of studies, why the written portions of the diploma are written so much earlier, the role of chain equation and psychometrics, as well as the art versus science in creating the diploma exam for social studies, if standardized testing should be applied in other provinces or even potentially considering a Canada-wide exam, how diploma exams used to be 100% of the final mark for students, and much more. Thank you for tuning in, and I really thank you all. It is really much appreciated, and hope you enjoy the show. Your name comes up in a lot of circles, but you want to get going?
Absolutely.
All right, my friend.
Okay.
Well, Mr. Coates, appreciate you coming on, man.
Oh, I'm great. I'm fantastic to be here.
Yeah. So, why study social studies? Why is it important for our students to learn social studies as a class?
Oh, boy, that's a sweeping question. I mean, I think the simplest answer is civics is so vitally important. It's always important. Mm-hmm. Maybe it's more important now than it's ever been, although I think any generation could say that. Yeah. But you think about where we're going as societies with so many counter-influences on students, that there needs to be a place where we can bring these students together and they can get maybe exposure to things that they're not going to get exposure to just by going into their own little bubbles. I mean, when you've got algorithms that are steering everybody into certain channels and that, it would be very easy for students to never really get out of a particular bubble, get out of a particular stream. And of course, I mean, I grew up with this too. You don't have to go back to, or go to the current times. I grew up in the 1970s, and I mean, I grew up at a time where the premier of the province was also the person we listened to on Sunday mornings because he was the radio preacher. And so, 5 days a week.
Who was that?
Ernest Manning. So
okay,
he ran what was called the Back to the Bible Hour. So our family was diehard social credit because social credit came in a depression when my dad was a farmer and everybody was suffering through the depression, and social credit came along. And I remember very distinctly going to a big social credit rally at the Jubilee Auditorium in the late 1960s, early 1970s, where it was just a big mass gathering. The Shumka dancers went up on stage, Ernest Manning made a speech, other people made speeches. It was just like a big love-in. because social credit was still in power in that time. And as I said, that Ernest Manning that was up on that stage was also the person that the family listened to on Sunday mornings doing the religious broadcast. And I did the Sunday school lessons that they sent out, mail order Sunday school lessons.
So did you grow up in public education here as well?
Oh, absolutely.
So was there more of like a religious component to it a little bit at all? Or maybe informally?
Public education really didn't have a religious component. But I mean, Alberta was a very different place in the 1960s when I grew up. And so, the school I went to was a small rural school, and it was frankly, quite a lily white school. That's not should be a shock to anybody. Yeah. And so a lot of people who would go to school would see each other at church. They'd see each other at this, that, and the other thing. And there certainly was a bit of a social pressure at that time that might be a little shocking today. I mean, I remember very distinctly our grade 4 teacher. We, as kids, you know how there can be different things you can go and buy, like hockey cards or whatever it could be. At one point in this time, probably about 1968, 67, there were these buttons you could buy, almost like hockey cards. They'd come in a little package you'd open up, and it would say something like "scram" or "get lost" or something really outlandish like this. And we'd put the buttons on, clip them onto our shirts. And one day, a number of us were wearing these. They were this latest phenomenon. And the grade 4 teacher said, "Everybody up here with those buttons, I want you to throw them in the garbage right now. Those things have been made by the communists, and they're trying to do this to undermine our society, and it's not going to be happening." And we all did. Not only did
I don't want to be a communist.
well, exactly. I mean, not only did we throw the buttons away, I think we were all in shock that we'd been supporting a communist cause, right? So I just grew up in a very much social studies home, but very much a right-wing social credit home. And when I got to university, I realized, I've not been in a cult, but I've certainly been in a very sort of controlled environment where social credit was the be-all and end-all and the whole bit. And so I'd always liked social studies, but when I hit university and I realized just how many sides there were to things and how much of another narrative there was to it, it just really caught on with me and said, this is going to be a profession. It's got to be a profession.
Yeah. And so how did you kind of cope with that, like, loss of that control environment? Because I find that's really what you're trying to establish in social studies, is trying to like widen the perspective of the students. So how did you kind of go about, because one of the things that I learned in university was that you're trying to like manufacture the educational event. Like you're trying to create the conditions that leads the student to like almost like a bit of an awakening of like seeing what they didn't see before. So how would you kind of go about that in your classrooms? Or it's usually informal, but
I think it was very deliberate that I always wanted students to be critically thinking about things. I always wanted them to feel comfortable that they could challenge what I was saying, they could question what I was saying. In fact, I would be quite happy if they do that, because that meant they were actually being engaged in it. I wanted them to see that there were a lot of different worldviews, and the worldview they might have of their own. And I think I tried to lead a bit by example too, to demonstrate I was a little bit open-minded. No, I mean, that didn't work for every student. I mean, if you teach enough students, you're going to have some students that love the way that's going, and other students that are never going to be particularly happy with that at all. Personally, I think it was an easier time than it is now, because when I was teaching, I started teaching in 1981, and through the 1980s into 1990s, you did not have a lot of the influences you have today. Students still were really watching, obviously it was cable, but I mean, a lot of people would have been watching the CBC or watching CTV, or there would still have been something called newspapers that people were looking at. And so there were some common strands everyone had that you could take a look at and reference to and everything like that. I think personally, although I'm not currently teaching high school, I think it would be a much bigger challenge today, because there are so many more streams of information coming at students, and then students can be a lot more selective, and families can be a lot more selective. So students, there's always been a case where students are going to come to school, in many cases, kind of aping what their parents say. And so certainly when I was teaching, there'd be times where I'd say, I hear the students saying this, but I also hear the parents saying that, and the student is...
And you can usually tell like the reaction of their face. Like you can usually see like once they kind of respond, it's like you start to see like the parental influence kind of come out.
Right.
But yeah, and then so how would you define critical thinking? And like what were some ways that you instilled the value of it in your classes when you were teaching, and even now?
Well, I think I always sort of had the idea that you don't simply accept things.
Yeah.
Don't simply say that's the way it's got to be or that's the way it is. Understand that things change. I mean, that was one of the good things about the social studies curriculum that I had to deal with for a lot of those years, is that it was about change. It was about, for instance, the Reformation. It was about the Renaissance, right? It was about the French Revolution. Those are, although very Eurocentric, they're very classic examples of situations where people simply said, no, status quo doesn't make any particular sense. I think it's time for a little bit of a change or something like that. And I would say to students, and we would do activities where you'd say, okay, if you're going to change something, how would you change it, right? I'll give examples. I would have students I had them do their own Treaty of Versailles. I said, okay, this war's happened. Here's why it happened. What would you do for a peace treaty? So I didn't even let them look at the Treaty of Versailles until they did their own. And then had them say, okay, now here's what you did. Let's take a look what actually happened. And that was a great activity because quite often the students could then say, oh, I like what we did better. Or oh, okay. So sometimes it's simply about turning them loose a little bit and giving them some liberty to think about these things, right?
And in terms of how the social studies curriculum has changed, how many different curriculums have you been a part of? Like, how often has it changed? 'Cause I know it's been 15, 16 years, and we're kind of veering on our next one here pretty soon. But
I think I taught essentially 3. The one that I first came in was very heavily focused on what was called the inquiry method.
Okay.
And there was what was called an inquiry cycle. The topics were not a whole lot different from the next one that rolled along. A lot of European history, right? Canadian civics and history. But I hated the inquiry approach. And that's actually a good point to pick up in something. That curriculum had what was called the inquiry wheel. And so here's the process students are going to go through. We're going to ask questions. They're going to research the question, blah, 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 blah. That drove me nuts.
Okay, why?
It wasn't my style. It didn't suit my style.
Like your thinking style?
My thinking style, and I also felt it was a little bit too rigid to maybe be the thing appropriate for everyone's thinking style. I mean, some kids might have said, this is a great way, the inquiry approach. But a lot of kids could have easily said, no, that's not where it should start. That's I don't want to ask questions first. I want to do this first. I want to do that first, right? I can give you an example of this. I mean, when I started teaching very early on in my teaching, I said to students, you're going to write compositions for me, essays, right? So what I want you to do is I want you to make an outline of your essay. Then I want you to make a rough copy. And then I want you to make a good copy. And I want to see all 3. So I want to see that you did your rough copy. I want to see your outline, and I want to see your good copy. And I had the students working on it one day. And there was a kid in my class named David, brilliant kid.
Yep.
David was absolutely brilliant kid. And I noticed he had sitting on his desk his good copy.
Yep.
And then he was writing what looked like a rough copy. So I said to David, David, what are you doing? He said, well, I'm writing my rough copy. I said, well, what's this? He said, well, that's my good copy. I said, well, why are you writing a rough copy? I said, well, I wrote my good copy, but you told me I have to have a rough copy. So now I'm taking my good copy and I'm making a rough looking version of my good copy. And then what I'm going to do from that is I'm going to make an outline because you told you I have to make an outline. In other words, David didn't need to do an outline. David didn't need to do a rough copy. He could sit down and write a good copy. But because I told him this is the process that's got to be done, he felt obliged that he had to go back and do a rough copy and then had to do an outline. And that was a big light bulb on moment for me. That was I doing that because that was my logic of how the best way to do it is. And by the way, it's not a bad logic. Do an outline, do a rough copy.
Yes. Yeah.
But it didn't suit everyone. And it was one of those aha moments for me about sometimes maybe we got to give the students some liberty to say, how does this work for you? What's the best way for you to work through this, right? And in David's case, he's kind of like Mozart, maybe. From what I understood, Mozart didn't sit down and write rough copies. He just simply wrote down whatever he wrote. David could write a perfectly good essay just right off the top of his head. But because I compelled him to do something else, he had to go back and do all those steps. And so I pretty early on in my teaching said, got to be a little careful about that. So even when we were building the social studies 33 exam, many years later, and I was exam manager for that exam. And everyone said, well, we've got to have pages for rough work and then pages for the good copy in the exam booklet. And we had a really good discussion about that. Said, no, let's not call it rough work. Let's not call it outline. Why don't we just simply put planning, right? And then on the other side, finished copy or something like that. And the reason we did that is because a lot of people agreed. No, if we say for a rough outline, well, some kids aren't going to do a rough outline. Some kids' planning would just be to write down a few words. And certainly Once we started having kids write those in those booklets, and you went and looked at the planning, there was a vast variety of ways kids did their planning. And so it was reinforcing that whole thing that we often are thinking about things in terms of how we think it should be done. It doesn't necessarily mean that's the way that the kid is going to think how it's going to be done.
Yeah, because I noticed even in the last couple of rounds of diploma marking, there's been like a hush-hush thing about, maybe not hush-hush, maybe hush is the wrong word, but on the first run of every essay, we had to record if they planned, and if they did plan, how many pieces of evidence did they use? That was kind of for the position paper as well. Right. Now, I'm sure they're tracking that data for whatever reason, but I'm wondering, like, how do you foresee the diploma exam changing, if at all, with the new curriculum coming out soon?
Well, I think it's going to depend a whole lot on the new curriculum.
Mm-hmm. So, like, what do you, from what you know, like, what do you think is the most contested part of the curriculum? Like, what do you think should be in the new curriculum?
Well, I can tell you what I think shouldn't be in the new curriculum. I think what shouldn't be in the new curriculum is that we somehow go back to a kind of a regurgitative narrative history of everything since some particular point in time, without there being some meaning attached to what the students are learning. Having looked at the, and I'm no longer in government, so I'm a little more free to speak, because I did actually work in the curriculum, the social studies curriculum, the most recent one, the one we're currently using for high school.
Yep.
But I'm no longer in government.
So what was that process like of creating?
Well, that was great. It was good. The product in the end, I wouldn't say was everything I would want it to be, but when you work in government, when you work in curriculum, you're never going to get the curriculum you want. You're going to get the curriculum that essentially a large body of people want, right? And it's fine. I mean, it's not again what I would necessarily pick, but it's okay. It was a very good process. That one was a good process. We had budget. We had people. We went out, did huge amounts of consultation. When we went out and consulted, not only was it the people building the program of studies, it was the people who were going to be doing the examinations, the diploma examinations. It was the people who were going to have to resource the textbooks or whatever was going to go along with it. Everybody was involved in the process. The French, the people who were going to have to do the French versions of everything. We had First Nations involvement. So we're talking here, 2005, 2006, 2007. And we were doing, I thought, a very, very thorough job. I mean, we spent hours and hours and hours simply on the preamble parts to it, which people often don't even read. They get right down into the meat of things, but we spent huge amounts of that. So it was a good process, and it's a decent curriculum. So what would be
a better curriculum? Like, what would be a better curriculum? Like, if it were up to you, like, what changes would you have made back then if you had like the full control of the wheel?
I personally, and again, this comes down to my style. You got to understand it. I personally would have probably liked a bit more specificity in some things.
Okay.
Now, some of that comes from the fact that at the same time as I was writing program studies, I was also still an exam manager building. I was currently managing at that point the Social Studies 30 exam. Right? And so for me, that's a little bit self-centered because as an exam manager, it's far easier to build an examination if there's a little bit more specificity what's in the program, because otherwise now you're starting to say, okay, can we ask this question? Or are kids actually going to be able to know that because it doesn't say in the program specifically, let's say Mussolini or whatever.
Okay, that makes sense.
So from my point of view, I preferred the prior curriculum in that it had that little layer of specificity. But you're always going to have that divide. There's going to be social studies teachers who say, no, I want open-ended. Just give me the basics. I'll backfill the detail. And then you'll get other people say, no. I need specifics. I need what do you want me to teach? And I think that will forever and a day be the way it goes. Because even in those days when we were going out to hammer out this newest curriculum, newest curriculum now, and obviously it's over 10 years old, you'd see those kinds of divisions. You'd see the teachers that wanted detail, and the teachers say, no, give me a little bit of liberty here. Don't constrain.
So, and kind of crafting liberty, because I know like you have your kind of main related issue questions for each one, but like when I was kind of going through my university education, it was almost you shouldn't really read the curriculum as being this like set document you have to follow word for word. It was like curriculum as document versus curriculum as like thing to engage with.
Right.
So what are your thoughts on that? Because I guess my point is, from like a newer perspective, it's okay. if I'm a few years in now, and now we're going to be teaching, like, let's just say in 2025, a new social studies curriculum, is there not still going to be a degree of flexibility that you could still teach fairly similar things, like when it comes to current events, or like including more about like Indigenous education? Because really, even though some of the things are expected more so today, these are things that you can still teach like within the guidelines of the current curriculum. So what are your thoughts there?
I think.
Am I wrong? Like what do you?
No, I think there's always going to be this wrestling match between, is the curriculum just supposed to be, and by the way, I better be careful about using the word curriculum. I tell my students all the time, it's not a curriculum, it's a program of studies.
Okay.
And if you want to, we can go into why that is.
Yeah, please, yeah.
But it's always going to be that wrestling match with, do we put a lot in there that gives people the specificity they need, or do we say, no, let's leave it a bit open-ended? And by the way, a lot of young teachers will come out and say, I need to know specifics. I don't want to.
Well, I can totally understand that, because especially if, like, let's just say not all social teachers are going to be specialized in history and whatever, or they might have different backgrounds where it's like, oh, hey, can you teach a 10-1 course this semester? Mm-hmm. So when it comes to having those specific examples to know, that can be a lot easier on the mind of kind of, you know where you're going and what you need to know and what do you need to relay.
Right.
Yeah.
I think 15 years into it, I could have just said, I'm going to teach the students this.
Yes.
I really could. Mm-hmm. First year teaching, I said, show me what I need to do. Give me the book. I need, the whole bit. I think where the danger falls in, and this actually can tie back a little bit to when I was an exam manager for social studies 33 and for 30, but maybe more specifically 33, I would have teachers phone me up and say, I'm teaching the course. I know there's a diploma examination here coming up. What textbook is the exam based on? And I would say, well, it's far from it. In fact, we are not even allowed to use anything that could be pulled from one of the textbooks.
Wait, what?
That's the rule. That's an absolute rule on a diploma examination. You cannot have a source like a cartoon or a quote or anything.
Okay, that makes sense.
Right?
Oh, yeah, okay. I never thought about that. It can't actually be exposed to.
And
interesting. I didn't think about that.
There's reasons for that. And again, I can get into that if you want. We'll see.
Please, yeah.
But what bothered me was this was a teacher who was saying the book is the curriculum, or the book is the program of studies. And that's not the case. The resources, the textbooks and those were never designed to be 100% of the program of studies. Rarely, unless they were custom built, which there were some custom built ones when they first came in. They weren't very particularly good, but they were custom built for the program of studies. Typically, when you build a program of studies, then you go and try and find a textbook that's going to have maybe 80% coverage or something like that. But there would be teachers that say, I'm teaching the book rather than I'm teaching
social studies. Yeah.
So you're going to wrestle with teachers who they need something. They need a structure, and the book would give them the structure. And so if they felt that the program didn't give them enough structure, then the book was the thing they could lean on and say, okay, good, the book is what I'm going to go with because that's going to give me the things I need, right? Social studies teachers are a pretty diverse lot. Mm-hmm. And so you're going to have the teacher says, we need more detail, we need more specifics. And you will have the teacher says, no, just, if you give me 8 outcomes in 4 months, 5 months, I'll be able to deal with that. It'll give me time for kids to do research, and give me time for kids to do this, that, the other thing, the whole bit, right? So where I fall on it isn't necessarily that important. It's that people are going to fall in different places.
Yes.
So when you design a program, you have to try and figure out, how do we do this? We know we're not going to please everyone, and you never do. You simply won't. A committee designed curriculum is going to be a committee designed curriculum.
Yeah. And so when you kind of were helping design the curriculum, because it's 2007, right? Was the year this one piloted or started out? Or maybe it was 08, 09. I'm not sure.
Yeah, I think the first diploma exam was about 2010. Yeah, so
okay.
Spun back a couple of years before that.
All
It's
right.
probably around 2008. It would have been grade 10 and moving forward from that, because I was working on the senior high, grade 9, 10, and 11, or grades 10, 11, and 12.
Okay, and so what changed from like the social 33 curriculum to the 30-1, or like the
30-2, for example.
I guess like when there was a change in curriculum, like what was the difference of like what they were teaching between 1995 and 2005 versus 2010 to current?
Oh, okay. 95 to 2005, you're going from the previous program, which for lack of a better word, we can call it a 3-column curriculum.
Okay.
So the first column was broad, generalized statements. The second column was, I guess you could say the first column was the big, broad idea. Yes. The second column was then a little bit more specificity. Then the third column was the illustrative examples. So an illustrative example might have been the D-Day invasion, which was to illustrate nations having to act to halt aggression or something like that. Was moving back on conflict is often the way people solve differences. So in other words, it was sort of a 3-column basis. And then we switched to what you see now, which is that you've got the overarching theme, you've got the 4 sections, and each of those overarching themes, you've got some statements down below that. Then in the statements down below, you've got the bracketed information at the bottom, which is either EG or IG, i.e., whatever it is saying. These are the illustrations you can use. So some of it was structure, but I think it went a little bit away from some of the specificity that there was in the 3 columns, right? So when I was building diploma examinations, I certainly had to look at all the 3 columns, but the third column gave me the assurance, okay, I'm able to mention Mussolini because I can see it right there in that third column, or I'm able to mention this or whatever, right? But remember that you don't build a curriculum to make the exam managers happy. You build a curriculum that you feel is the necessary curriculum to do. But it's still going to come down to who's in the room, who's doing the designing, what has the consultation process led to, any number of things like that, right? What is eventually going to look like.
So has it always been the source analysis and the position paper? Or was that like a recent one?
No, Social Studies 33 actually had a booklet, in many ways which I preferred better, where it was divided into 5 sections, and in those 5 sections, 4 of the 5 sections would have a writing task after the multiple choice questions. So, for example, you'd have one section on political systems, and so you'd have a series of questions on political systems, about 15.
Okay, yeah.
And then at the end of that, there would be maybe 4 candidates speaking about a particular issue, and then the student had to write on which of the candidates would you vote for.
So that's pretty much the assignment 3 currently, but like that was for like. So sorry, is there Social Studies 33? Is there like a -2 equivalent to that, or is that
30-2 is the essentially equivalent to Social Studies 33 used to be?
Okay, so what did -1 used to be?
30.
Oh, okay, right? All right, yeah.
So so the Social Studies 33 exam at that point, which is what I was the manager of. Then the next section would be in economics, for example. And then, you've done a 4-candidate thing, so maybe this one would be 2 pictures that both had some relevance to economics, and then another writing assignment. So the students would do some questions, do a writing assignment, do a few more questions, do a writing assignment. I love that, and I think a lot of teachers like that because quite often what would happen is the students could use those multiple choice questions to kind of help them along in figuring out their writing task, right?
And it is a bit more specific.
It's more specific, and then it allowed the students to do all their focus in politics. Get those questions out of the way.
It was like the economic, social, political kind of 3 lens.
And then topic B at that point was essentially 20th century European history, bit of world history. And so they did the next section on World War II. Then they did a section on the Cold War. Then they did a section on the contemporary world. And of those 3 sections, any 2 of those 3 would have writing tasks assigned to them.
Okay.
Now, that all got changed in large part because there was, if you want to know the backstory to it a little bit, there had been some labor action going on, and it looked like teachers at some point might withdraw their services, which would mean maybe no marking could go on. And so the decision kind of was a decision to say, let's make 2 separate booklets. We'll have a booklet with the writing task and the booklet with the multiple choice. And if we do the writing task early, so the students do the writing in early June or early mid-June, we can do the marking before July hits because we can compel teachers to come in and mark in June. The old model had been where the teachers didn't come in and mark until the summer.
Interesting.
Right?
Okay.
Because the students didn't write until later in June, and the one booklet had both the multiple choice and the writing in it. That model, in many ways, worked, but if there'd ever been, for some reason, some sort of labor circumstance, you wouldn't have been able to compel those teachers necessarily to come in July and mark. So the reason why those booklets were separated out and the multiple choices pulled out separately from the written, you could argue there's some good pedagogical reason for that, but you could also say there was a little bit of a political driver in that as well.
Yeah, it does seem very compartmentalized, whereas it does seem like the old model is a bit more fluid. Like they actually were more related.
Because I felt now.
So were they as intense? Because I find in trying to deliver the source analysis position paper, there's so much more to teaching it than meets the eye in terms of, and I find students will vary in their struggles with it, but I just find with the position paper specifically, the kids usually get it a little bit better, and the source analysis is usually more of a challenge. But I think like it does seem very vague to the kids.
The sources.
Yeah, I guess with the essay format in terms of the way that it's compartmentalized, the students often struggle like going from course content, going into writing an essay kind of thing. But yeah, so yeah, it seems less intense a little bit, but.
And these are, I mean, it can vary from student to student, obviously.
Yes.
It can vary a little bit maybe from the -1s to the -2s in terms of their ability to deal with those things, although they've designed them a little bit differently on the -1 from the -2, right, in terms of how they deal with the sources and where they're supposed to go with them. But the -1 was quite a step away from what it had been before, because the -1, when it was still Social Studies 30, there was one composition you did, which ended up sometimes being quite an extensive response, and it really was truly a position paper. So in that case, you didn't use the sources. You simply were asked a question, and you had to just bring to bear.
So there was no prompt; it was a question.
Well, all the prompt would have been is, it depends when you look at the 30 exam, because in the early going, there was a little bit more detailed guidance given to the students before the question came about. Typically, some people believe that governments should have strict control over the economy to ensure that all people have a good standard of living. Okay. Other people believe that governments should be laissez-faire and let, blah, 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 blah. And then the question might have been, to what extent do you believe that governments should manage the economic affairs of the nation, something like that.
Oh, okay.
So it started off like that. Now, it had its merits, but one of the problems was many students simply aped that little introduction that was given before they got to the writing task. And so the first couple of paragraphs they had were essentially recopying out that little intro.
Cribbing, as they would say.
Well, cribbing. No matter what you do, no matter how you construct the writing assignments, you're going to run into some issue. I mean, there's no perfect writing assignment. I just don't believe it. What they do now has its issues. What we did back then has its issues. And the markers are the ones that can point that out, because the markers will be the one that will be going up to me when I was an exam manager, Dwayne now, or Barry before me, and say, you know what, we gotta do something about this. Kids aren't really kind of getting this the way we'd like. And those assignments evolve and change, just as the same as the scoring rubrics evolve and change as we sort of figure this out. So we're kind of still in standardized testing, making it up a bit as we go along. And okay. We typically, after many of the marking sessions, sit down with teachers and say, what can we do better? What can we do differently? And there were different times over the years I worked where we'd call in some of the veteran teachers when the marking was done and say, okay, how can we fix the rubric up? Or, okay, how can we make it so we don't get these, quote, canned essays so much that we were getting? What can we do about that? And if you went back and looked at a 1984 exam, and then looked about a 1992, 93 exam, and then you looked at about a 2008 exam, and they're all the same, essentially basic type of exam, except for the fact that at one point then we split off the multiple choice from the writing, you would see an evolution of how that particular essay question was asked. And certainly could happen now. I mean, an exam manager today could say, after the session's done, we're going to bring somebody in or going to bring a few of our teachers in and have them stay back after the marking's done and say, well, what do we do differently? How do we improve things? And that's, to Alberta Education's credit, that's been one of the good things they've done, is have had a huge amount of teacher involvement and input into those kinds of things. When I first designed the Social Studies 33 exam, 1994, 95, I might get credit for being an exam manager, but there was a huge number of teachers came in and gave.
So, what is the process that goes into? Because it's a very secure, secretive process for good reason, I would argue, when it comes to the delivery of the diploma exam. Right. But what is kind of the process of creating one? Like, you're exam manager, so I guess June session ends, everything's been marked. What do you do now for January?
Well, the January exam's already built.
Okay, so how far in advance are they built?
It can vary a little bit. because some exams are rolled over.
What do you mean by rolled over?
Oh, well, for example, you could have an August exam that ends up being a January exam, or you could have a November exam that ends up being a June exam, right? Intact, because they're totally secure.
Okay.
So we would typically, years ago, an August exam would then end up as maybe a January exam a year and a half down the road, right?
Oh, because are you reusing them?
Oh, absolutely.
And that's why there's only selected released items?
Well, if you go back far enough, there were no... we didn't equate the exams. And so if you went back far enough, because you're quite young, you won't remember this, but when we first started the diploma examinations, I was quite young. And the exams were released at the time of writing. So you would get an exam booklet as a teacher to take a look at. You could see all, in that day, Social Studies 30 had 70 items. And so there were 70 items. Bingo. You had them right away. The whole bit. You got to keep the booklet.
Okay. Wow.
Right?
All right.
And plus the writing assignment, because you'd see it. So you got to keep the booklet. And that went on for quite a while. And but that was an unsustainable process.
Yeah, I was going to say that can be very exhaustive when you're trying to think of like 70 new questions every 4 times a year, because there's 4 different sessions, right?
Well, the August exam was secured. So basically the January and June exams were the only ones in those days. And so they're the only ones released. So 140 items a year, which is not a small amount. That's a lot. Now,
especially with the testing that they go through. So what were you saying about teachers just then?
Oh, the teachers loved it because, of course, these are questions you could use in your own exams. As a social studies high school teacher, a few years into the diploma exam, I had all my exams using
200 questions
because they were they'd been proofed, they'd been field tested,
reliably tested.
You could know they were reliable. Now, why that changed was because the one thing we didn't do in all those years was we didn't equate the exams, and you couldn't equate the exams.
What do you mean by equate the exams?
Let me explain that. Yeah. When a student writes January and all of the questions are then released, the next group of students are writing a totally different exam. You can assume that the exams are of the same difficulty because you field tested all the questions, you know the average in all the questions.
Yeah.
But what can happen over time, over the years, you're always field testing new questions and you're putting them on exams, and you're always aiming for sort of roughly a certain mean that the exam's going to average out to. Mm-hmm. You can't know if the standards are getting harder and harder and harder because you're always completely using new exams. And if the students out there doing the field tests are getting better, but you're always going to aim for your exam to average around 65, well, how do you know that by 1990 a 65 would not have been, a 60 in 1984? You don't. The only way you can do that is to maintain some of the questions from exam to exam to exam to exam. And if the students do better on those questions as time passes, you know that the body of students doing these exams is stronger than the students who were doing them 5 years ago. So what the government essentially does right now is what's called chain equating. Okay. So we've been equating. In fact, I was still an exam manager when we started equating Social Studies 30 at that point, Social Studies 30. And this would have been probably around 2003 or something like that. Mm-hmm. Through what's called chain equating, you could still be equating current exams back to that one. Now, you can't in the case of social because we had a curriculum change, program of studies change.
Yep.
But when you start a new program, you can set what's called a baseline exam. And it's a very involved process. We could go for hours in this.
Okay.
And once you get the baseline exam set.
So meaning like the first one that's ever written within that program of studies?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah.
And then from that, you can continue to build future exams using some of the questions from that baseline exam. And then you get another exam down the road where no longer are any of the questions on that exam ones that were on the baseline exam. But you can equate those questions back to questions on the exam in between that had questions like exam. So you create this change.
Like tree branches almost kind of like moving out a little bit.
You can go for quite a while where 15 years down the road, you're still able to equate back to an exam 15 years previously, even though not a single one of the questions on that exam 15 years down the road was even remotely on that exam 15 years ago. But you do this process of chain equating. There's a lot of what is called psychometrics involved in this.
Okay, so what do you mean by that? What's psychometrics?
Psychometrics is essentially people who are trained in data analysis and statistics and how, essentially, excuse me, how to do these things. The psychometricians, it's an area of psychology.
Yep.
And
hence why assessment is in educational psych.
Yeah.
Is that why? Okay. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so when it comes to building exams, the exam manager is typically, and certainly in Alberta, is a social studies teacher, for instance, social studies, right? The social studies teacher or biology teacher, whatever the subject might be. But the psychometrician is not a teacher at all. The psychometrician's been trained in psychometrics. And psychometrics is all about understanding how to critically analyze if a test is reliable, if a test is valid, if particular questions are reliable, if particular questions are valid, how to set up equating of exams so that you have equivalent forms written over time, right? So there would be a huge amount of psychometrics on the SATs. There'd be a huge amount of psychometrics on a intelligence test or anywhere you go. And psychometricians work in all kinds of areas. Data analysis, when you start doing surveys and polling, you can use psychometrics to make sure that the surveys and polls are good. So diploma examinations there's the art of them, which is the exam manager and the item writers, who are teachers, building the questions. And then there's the science of them. And a lot of that science comes down to psychometricians, who are the ones who often advise the exam manager and how to make sure they've got valid, reliable exams.
So earlier on, you're talking about the curriculum versus the program of studies. What was your difference there?
Well, I even tell my students this all the time. Even though they call it the curriculum branch at Alberta Education, curriculum to me is what the teacher ends up with. Okay. Because to me, the program of studies is the guide booklet that tells you what to teach. But you've got to figure out your methodology to teach that. You have to have your resources. You have to do your assessment of the students, the whole bit. To me, that's the curriculum. The curriculum is the whole shooting match. It's the program of studies, but it's also the methodology used to teach. It's the assessments you use to gather information about the students, and it's the various resources you use to essentially bring that program to life and give students some ways to enter that program and understand it. So to me, a teacher builds the curriculum. Okay. Alberta Ed simply provides a program of studies. So we throw those words around as equivalent. And you'll often hear people say, oh, there's a new curriculum coming out. To me, it's always, and I'll get caught in that too, where I say new curriculum, but to me, there's a program of studies that we produce. A teacher's got to take that program of studies and create a curriculum out of it. So you as a teacher, you make choices. You make choices. How are you going to teach that? You make choices. Is this going to be the sage on the stage or the guide on the side? You know, all of those trite phrases we have. How are you going to assess them? What resources are they going to go to on a field trip? Are they going to use a book? Are they going to go use the internet? That's the curriculum. Okay,
like the activation of it.
Well, I think it's the whole shooting match. It's all of these pieces put together. The government doesn't really, in my mind, do the curriculum. It says to you, here's the program of studies. And if you think about it, if the government starts to say, and here's how thou shalt teach it, then you'd very likely have the ATA saying, well, hold on a second here. You're starting to overstep your boundaries. Teachers are professionals. And so you should say to teachers, here's the program, but you better give teachers a bit of liberty in terms of how am I going to teach it. As you know, the AT is probably not 100% uncomfortable with standardized testing, but they're not exactly on board either. And I think part of the reason for that is that is part of this interplay of, you know what, if you have standardized testing, that starts to become a little bit, manipulative of what the teacher is going to teach or how they're going to teach it, the whole bit. So in the profession, we're always having a bit of this wrestling match.
Well, this is exactly where I wanted to go. I remember what I was going to say. Because when it comes to, like, you're talking about psychometrics, you're talking about the exam being created months, if not years in advance. In my first kind of bout of diploma marking, it was, for what standardized testing is, Alberta does the hell out of it. So how, in like the dealings that I've had with you, it's almost maybe inadvertently and maybe like not purposefully, you're almost kind of always giving the justification or providing the case for standardized testing. Like, why do you think some provinces don't do it? And do you think it should be something that each province does adopt?
Well, and I ironically, I was the director of diploma examinations, and then for a number of years I was an examination manager. I didn't write standardized tests when I was in high school. Alberta had what were called the departmental exams in one form or another, and I think almost without interruption from even before Alberta was even a province. I think it went back to the 1890s or something like that, right? They dropped them in 1972. And up to 1972, and I don't know how many years prior to that, they were 100% exams. So when a student wrote English, for example, that was 100% of your grade 12 mark in English. Not 50%, not 30%. It was 100%. Now, as a kid going through school, I was getting a little nervous about this. And so
as you would, 100%.
And my brothers had to write them. But I didn't. They dropped them in 1972. I graduated after that. Mm-hmm. But I don't think I necessarily fully benefited from not having those standardized.
So why? Why do you think there's the benefit of standardized testing?
Well, look, I got to university and it was pretty evident pretty quickly on that I hadn't been held to the same standard as some of my compatriots were in my first year courses. Mm-hmm. They had far better training.
So what do you mean, what was trained better that you saw value in?
Well, for one thing, I think they knew how to approach being in university, which I didn't. And then I think they just had a little bit better depth of knowledge of some of the subject material that we were looking at in university. Mm-hmm. And I mean, maybe that was just partly my fault too. Maybe mm-hmm. I wasn't just a serious enough student, whatever it was. So that was part of my thinking that, maybe it's not so bad if there's some kind of an external test.
Well, because you're pretty much basing yourself off relative to your peers wherever you are. And so if you're pretty much performing at like a decent level wherever you are, you aren't really aware. Because in kind of some of the discussions that we've had, because one of the things I wanted to talk to you about was lately, the last 7, maybe 8 years or so, we've seen the diploma worth go from 50 to 10 to 30. Obviously, COVID played a pretty...
Yep.
So do you remember why the decision was made to go from 50 to 30
in
2016? What was that for? And did you agree with it?
I didn't. Mm-hmm. I had to at the point because mm-hmm. I was working for the government and I had no choice. It was either agree with it or essentially leave the government. Personally, no. I had been for a while in my own mind, having been an exam manager and also having been a director of diploma exams, my own mind was to get rid of any weighting at all. I just didn't like the idea even of the 50%, and I'll explain why. And one of the reasons, by the way, I defend the exams, and you did mention they're kind of Cadillac exams. They really are. They're in many ways. I could go into detail on that, but they really are. But even at 50%, one of the problems was if a student got and this is not totally unusual, not common, but not unusual. Let's say a student got 85 from the teacher, and then they got a 50 on the exam. So now you took a blend of that. So you said, okay, 85 and 50, let's say, adds up to 130. So now you get a blended mark of 65. Well, what the heck does that mean? Somebody said this is an 80 student. Someone said they're a 50 student. Now we ballpark it and say you're a 65 student. Now you've marked, right? Mm-hmm. Okay. Now if you mark an essay and you gave that essay an E, which is equivalent to a 5, right? Yep. Now what if somebody gave it a 1, which is the P, right? Would that stand? No. The rules of marking that essay would say those two scores are too discrepant, and we're not going to give it an S, which is, halfway between an E and a P. We won't do that. Mm-hmm. So at that little micro scale and marking that composition on one category, we won't allow that to happen. Yet at the big macro scale, a teacher gives a student an 80, the diploma gives them a 40, let's say, and we'll say, okay, we'll give them a 60. And in my mind, I said, that's ludicrous. The 60's meaningless.
It's literally the range of possibilities. Like you're not even giving them an accurate...
I mean, what does that 60 mean? Yeah. Right? It's what we call a meaningless mean. It doesn't mean anything. If today here in Fort McMurray, it's -10, and if Kingston, Jamaica, it's +30, and you say, well, the average is +15 or something like that. Well, so what? What does that mean? So what if the average is +15? Kingston, Jamaica's 30, and we're -10, right? So in my mind... I felt that the best thing that the government could have done, and I didn't get a lot of traction for this, I still advocate for this, was just report both marks. If the teacher gives the student...
Because that gets a lot of flack as well, reporting. They don't do that, right? They currently don't report the diploma grade as well as the course grade?
No, what the transcript will do is report for the student the school-awarded mark, the diploma mark, and then the blended mark. And of course, right now it's a 30%. Mm-hmm. I just felt any blend is misleading. Now, there would have been problems with that because if you said, okay, we're not going to have a blended mark. We're just going to have the teacher mark and the diploma mark. Yep. What's Rutherford going to do? Like, how are you going to get the Rutherford determined? Would a student pass, for example, if the teacher gave them a 90 and a diploma gave them a 40? What are you going to do now? The diploma says you don't pass this course. The teacher says you pass with flying colors. So what do? So there's certainly reasons for the blend. I just don't think, I just don't like the idea of a blend. I still advocate and say, because, for example, in Ontario, because you were talking about why don't other provinces have this?
Like why isn't there even like a Canadian exam? Like why?
Good. Well, the biggest problem in social studies would be how on earth would you ever do a national social studies exam? I mean, it's too much different. And I can tell you right off the bat that Quebec would almost never opt into that because almost anything that you could see suiting the rest of Canada probably wouldn't.
Yeah.
And I think all the provinces might be to that extent, falling into that kind of trap. It is a problem, though, because you can have, we in the province of Alberta do have varying standards from school to school to school. There's no question about that. You can look in the data and you can see that. Some teachers hold the students to much harder standard than other teachers. That's an issue. Yeah. But if you go beyond that, how do you know that an 80% student in English in Newfoundland is the same as an 80% student in Alberta or BC or wherever? How do you do that? And now you're supposed to say, oh, we're going to let you into Waterloo, or we're going to let you into UBC or U of S, or right? How do you do that? Because, well, frankly, they're coming from all these different jurisdictions. And how do you know there's any equivalency to those? And so it's a really difficult thing. I mean, that's why there are things like SATs, and that's why there are.
So do you have much experience dealing with like standardized testing in the U.S.?
A little bit. I did some work for the GED.
Okay.
Years and years ago, which was essentially basically giving adults an equivalent to getting their high school diploma. The GED, that's kind of this idea of it doesn't really matter where you're from, you write the same test.
Okay.
You had a Canadian GED and an American one. I wasn't particularly thrilled with the exam, but that's sort of the idea. Let's have sort of a standardized, a standardized test that everybody's doing the same test. It's a decent idea. It was, well, maybe I'm being polite when I say it wasn't too bad. It was a pretty bad test. I actually did editing on it, and it needed work. That way. It was source based, which was a good idea, but just didn't really do, I thought, a very particularly good job with the sources.
Okay, and then so do you have an experience teaching in any other provinces at all?
No.
Yeah, because like what would you say to people who say we should get rid of standardized testing? Because my experience is pretty much going to university and talking to everyone who's in my kind of cohort is that's what we're taught, but then we're kind of thrown into a system. So if anything, how do you kind of adjust yourself to kind of make sure you are teaching the standard? And like, should they be, I guess it's kind of circling back to the same question a little bit, but like, it doesn't make sense to me why Alberta does it so well, but then other provinces would be so vehemently opposed to that.
Go back to the Constitution, it gave provinces the management over education, and that's sort of where that spins from. I do like to joke that in the education faculty, if I started a Friends of Standardized Testing club, we could meet in a broom closet because it's just simply, by the time the students get to my course, they've had probably 3 years of standardized tests bad, teacher tests good. I've often said, look, if you can demonstrate to me that all teachers are holding students to the same standard, and so it really doesn't matter which teacher you go to, which school you go to, the whole bit, you will be treated equivalently. They say, fine, good, we don't need standardized testing. Perfect. No problem whatsoever. I don't believe that, right? And I don't know if you've seen the analogy I've used or not, but optometrists absolutely rely on standardized tests. Like if you go to an optometrist, it doesn't really matter which optometrist you go to. You're going to see a letter E at a particular size, which is going to illustrate if you can see that from a particular distance, then this is what your vision is, right? You know that, and you can be comfortable in that. You could go to an optometrist here today and in another week be in another part of the world, literally, and go to an optometrist and be pretty comfortable you're going to get the same metrics being used to determine your vision. We can't say that about education. You can't say that if you had taken your social studies course here, that it would be guaranteed that the standard you were held to would have been the same as if you'd taken it at the opposite end of the province or something like that. And so for me, that's always going to be one of the challenges, one of the justifications for standardized tests is it's sort of our best effort to try and create that eye chart in an education setting, right? Doctors have their, for taking blood pressure, hygrometer, whatever it's called, for blood pressure. You name the profession. I've got two sons who are engineers. They have standards all over the place that they have to follow, right? We have standards, sort of, when we create programs of studies with these statements. The problem is that those don't give us a very particularly clear picture of what is it going to translate into in it for a grade 11 student to say that that's an excellent student or that's a satisfactory student or that student's not yet at an acceptable standard based simply on your interpretation of some statements in a program of studies. Standardized tests are one of the goals of them is to try and communicate this is what that looks like.
Okay. Yeah, because one of the main things because really they might say, oh, different parts of the province could have access, different levels of access, et cetera, to resources, like stable conditions. But really the goal is, despite that, you're trying to deliver the same quality of education to each area. So that does help with that. Right. So one of the things that that I've been often talking about is when it comes to performance assessment specifically, when it comes to creating an effective performance assessment, one of the struggles I've had is trying to create like meaningful group work that actually you can apply like an individual grade to it. So like, were there any like specific projects or like recommendations or advice that you would give to kind of help that process?
Well, I think group work is great, but I think group work is the precursor to getting information about individual student performance. I don't think it's a way to get the student's individual score or individual mark or whatever you want to call it. I think it's a way for the student to do the preparatory work where they're going to build the skills or build the knowledge. So then you can find some other means for that student to then demonstrate that they really get it. Again, group work's great, but as soon as you do it, you don't have any comfort anymore that you know just what is that student's own ability and what is just the net benefit they get from working, benefit or drawback from working in a particular group.
Hey everyone, thank you all for tuning in. Really do appreciate it. Just wanted to say again, if there are any issues with professional conduct and or you would like to share your own story, experience, or have something you would like to contribute to the show, please do not hesitate to reach out at lucasrdclark97@gmail.com or send a direct message on Instagram to @MrClarkAfterDark. Hope you all enjoyed, potentially found something of use, and of course, please do not forget to subscribe. See you guys all next time. Unless you're scared.